For many, the story of John Wayne Gacy is one of the most frightening and disturbing stories of an American serial killer. He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to parents of Danish and Polish descent, and grew up in a dysfunctional family. He was the second of three children, with an alcoholic and violent father, John Stanley Casey, and a homemaker mother, Marion Elaine Robinson. Gacy's life was marked by physical and psychological abuse inflicted by his father. This oppressive family atmosphere deeply affected Gacy's childhood, as he was constantly humiliated and beaten with a belt by his father and his brothers. The violence was not limited to the children, but also involved the mother, Marion, who suffered physical abuse from her husband. As a child, John was an overweight boy who did not share his father's typical interests. He was not interested in sports or male games that his father would like him to play. On the contrary, John was fascinated by the world of flowers and classical music. John's father saw this interest as a weakness and accused him of being effeminate. John constantly lived in the shadow of his father, seeking his approval, and which he rarely received. His father even chose his son's name, John Wayne, inspired by actor John Wayne, known for his tough guy and hero roles, a name that would weigh heavily on Gacy's psyche. The relationship between John and his father is tense, with his father accusing him of being effeminate and doing everything to marginalize him. Young John develops an identity crisis and constantly walks on a razor's edge, trying to avoid sparks with his father. In addition, John's mother offers him affection, which is interpreted as weakness by his father, who insults him by calling him sissy, an offensive word for someone who is effeminate. His childhood is characterized by constant fear, violence, and lack of esteem from his father. At the age of 8, John suffers a traumatic event when he is molested by a family friend, a fact that he keeps secret to avoid his father's violent reaction. At 11 years old, John falls off a swing, causing a blood clot in his brain that remains undiagnosed for 5 years. This condition causes frequent fainting spells, adding to an already compromised health condition, as he is diagnosed with heart failure at the age of 17. The heart disease forces him to spend much of his adolescence in the hospital. This condition prevents him from playing sports, which is another source of frustration for his father, who considers him another failure and suspects that his son will become gay. His father's perception was partly correct, because John Gacy soon realizes that he is attracted to men, which further upsets his identity. Despite his father's accusations, John does everything to suppress his sexuality, even marrying a woman, Marilyn, with whom he has 2 children, Michael and Christine. His inability to relate to women and his constant attraction to men put a strain on his marriage, which eventually fails. Although John claimed to be at most bisexual, he continued to hide his homosexuality, repressing it. After the divorce, John Wayne Gacy continues his life and career. He works in politics, becoming an assistant to a Democratic candidate and running for local elections. He later moves to Las Vegas, where he works in a mortuary and even sleeps among the corpses. This is a dark period, culminating in a disturbing event in which he attempts to abuse a corpse but repents and asks his mother to come home. In 1971, he returns to Chicago, where he begins to build a new, seemingly normal life. He works as a cook's assistant in a restaurant and meets Carol, whom he marries. However, his attraction to men continues to torment him, leading to the failure of his second marriage. This drives him to commit his first sexual assault in 1972, an act of violence against a young man who reports him. The charges against Gacy are later dropped due to an inexplicable error in the trial. The parole board never learns of the arrest, and Gacy continues to live an apparently normal life. John Wayne Gacy's rise continued when he founded his construction company, PDM Contractors, and became an active member of the community, engaging in charity work and political activities. His popularity grew, becoming a reference point in the local community. He continued to perform as a clown, dressing up as Pogo the Clown. With this character, Gacy participated in parties and parades, even making unwanted sexual advances to women present. In 1972, John began consuming homosexual pornography, developing a tendency towards sadism that manifested in violent and sexually deviant acts. His hunger for power and control drove him to seek young victims, sometimes posing as a police officer to lure them into his trap. John Wayne Gacy, a man who could have been part of the circus but instead became a terrible figure in history. No one would suspect a clown like him, or so they thought. His obsession with clowns was evident. His house was a haven for these funny creatures. Paintings, figurines, and even clown-shaped lamps decorated every corner of his home. However, there was something sinister about this obsession. A killer clown, a concept as frightening as it is extravagant but real. According to some, even a source of inspiration for Stephen King himself in writing It. His fame spread so much that the family dog, Penny, was named after Pennywise, the ruthless clown from the literary work. Gacy led an apparently respectable and powerful life in the community. He was a successful entrepreneur and had the opportunity to hire whomever he preferred in his company. He chose to recruit young men who were attractive and inexperienced. His apparent justification was that he wanted to train people from scratch and mold them according to his desires. In reality, the truth was quite different. The turning point came when Robert Peast, a 15-year-old who worked at a local supermarket, disappeared after talking to Gacy. Peast had lent his jacket to a colleague that day, and for no apparent reason, he had put a receipt from the pharmacy where he worked in the pocket. This receipt was found in Gacy's house, proving that he had lied when he denied being in the pharmacy. Although there was no concrete evidence, Gacy was put under surveillance. However, young men continued to disappear, and one of them, Charles Hattala, was found dead in a river. Although it seemed like an accidental death, the coincidences and evidence were becoming increasingly evident. Gacy was questioned by the police but was not immediately arrested. Subsequently, investigations revealed a ring belonging to a missing boy, John Allen Zeke, who had left the initials JAS. The authorities were able to trace John Zeke's high school and, by contacting his parents, discovered that he had been missing for some time. The pressure on the investigations was growing. Gacy's house had been searched, revealing a series of disturbing objects, including police badges that he used to lure young men. Gacy was placed under continuous surveillance, yet despite everything, he continued to evade justice. However, the moment would soon come when the masks would finally come off and the truth about his horrible double life would emerge. But this is only the beginning of the story of John Wayne Gacy, one of the most terrifying serial killers in U.S. history. His shocking story will reveal further horrors and unveil the darkest side of humanity. Keep reading to find out what lies behind the face of this killer clown. John Wayne Gacy, a man who hid a dark secret, a macabre truth that would shock the world. His life seemed apparently normal, but beneath the surface lurked a monster. His name was linked to mysterious disappearances and an unsettling atmosphere that surrounded his existence. It all began when a young man disappeared along with his car. Worried parents tried to collaborate with the police, revealing the make and license plate number of their son's vehicle. What emerged was shocking. The car had been sold by John Gacy to one of his employees, Michael Rossi, a young man who had shared life with Gacy until 1977. Gacy seemed to be constantly involved, if not responsible, for these mysterious disappearances, but detectives needed concrete evidence, corpses. Until then, they had found no bodies except one, that of Charles Hattala, buried under a store denied by Gacy. However, a lead emerged when the parents of the missing young man mentioned above revealed the disappearance of valuable items from their son's room, including a television. The detectives, determined to uncover the truth, visited Gacy's house on a pretext. Gacy was aware of the constant surveillance, but his arrogance seemed to know no bounds. He invited them into his home, offering them coffee as if they were friends. While one of the detectives went to the bathroom, he took the opportunity to inspect the house in search of the television, but they found much more than they had expected. When the detective entered Gacy's bedroom, he found the missing television. However, during the visit to the bathroom, something disturbing happened. The air coming from the exhaust duct had a horrifying smell. It was the unmistakable smell of death for those who had smelled it in the past. Meanwhile, detectives interrogated Michael Rossi, Gacy's former roommate, discovering that he had carried out strange jobs at Gacy's request, including pouring lime into a void under the house. It was at that moment that detectives understood the terrible secret. Gacy was hiding his young victim's bodies under his house's floor. These discoveries led detectives to request a second search warrant, putting Gacy in a state of increasing paranoia. In an act of desperation, Gacy tried to block investigations by suing authorities and requesting an end to surveillance. But on December 20th, 1978, the monster in Gacy gave in. During a meeting with his lawyer, Sam Amarante, he confessed his horrible secret. Gacy said, "I have been the judge, the jury, and the executioner of many, many people. Now I want to be that for myself, too." He began to reveal his dark past, confessing to having killed at least 30 boys, hiding their bodies under his house, and even throwing 5 of them into a river. In reality, his confession was only partly true. Many of his victims were not young prostitutes, but boys deceived by Gacy's cunning. They had not died accidentally, but had been victims of his sadism. After the confession, Gacy, drunk and exhausted, fell asleep. The lawyer, confused and frightened, informed the detectives of the situation. Fearing that Gacy might commit suicide or flee, they asked him to hold him at all costs. When Gacy woke up, he ran away, but the police followed him. His desperate escape confirmed their fears. He was afraid of being caught. After giving drugs to a minor, the police obtained an arrest warrant for Gacy. On December 21st, 1978, he was arrested. Shortly thereafter, they obtained a second search warrant for his home. While Gacy was in custody, investigators began digging under his floor. What they found was a real horror. Human bones decomposed for years were evidence of his horrible crimes. The days following the arrest were marked by countless interrogations. Gacy told a story of terror, revealing the names of his victims and the details of their murders. The victims were young men, some of whom had been lured to bus or train stations, while others were his employees. Gacy used a rope to exercise control over their lives by suffocating them at will. Then he hid their bodies in the dark interstice under the floor of his house. The stories of his victims are chilling. Timothy McCoy, strangled after a night of drugs and alcohol. John Bukowich, killed over a salary dispute. Daryl Sampson, an 18-year-old boy, disappeared after a confrontation with Gacy. The murders continued without stopping. Young boys disappeared, buried in the darkness of his house. Gacy confessed to other murders, some unidentified victims, other young lives torn from grieving families. Gacy was a remorseless monster, and his crimes had shaken the entire world. As months passed, the truth about these horrors emerged. Gacy had killed many people, young lives broken without mercy. His ferocity had left indelible marks on the families of the victims and in the heart of society. His capture revealed a nightmare that no one could have ever imagined. In the deep heart of the 1970s, in a quiet residential area of Norwood Park, Chicago, a man led an apparently normal life. His name was John Wayne Gacy, but under this facade of respectability lay a monster capable of unimaginable horrors. His story is one of the darkest pages in American criminal history. Gacy was a skilled builder, a respected entrepreneur, and an active member of the local community. However, behind his mask of model citizenry lay a cemetery of young men buried in the dark underground of his house. He literally lived above the bodies of these innocent victims, a macabre secret that would have shocked the world. Among Gacy's victims was also the son of a Chicago police sergeant, an 18-year-old boy named Robert Gilroy, who had the misfortune to live just blocks away from the killer. 10 months after Gilroy's death, another young man named John Mowery disappeared, and his body was discovered under Gacy's floor along with other victims, including Russell Nelson's body. A 21-year-old young man was among the victims, who were all employed by Gacy before being brutally killed. 4 weeks after these murders, Gacy killed Robert Winch, a 16-year-old boy, and Tommy Bowling, a 20-year-old young father. These are just some of the victims found in Gacy's house, buried under his floor. There were 5 more whose bodies were thrown into a river because, as Gacy himself confessed, there was no more space to hide them in his house. However, only 4 of these bodies were found. Timothy O'Rourke, a 20-year-old young man who had accepted a job from a mysterious builder, clearly Gacy. Frank Landingen, 19 years old, James Mazzara, 20 years old, and Robert Peast, an employee of Gacy who worked in a pharmacy. But the list of Gacy's victims is long and chilling, with more than 35 young men brutally killed one after the other. The question that arises spontaneously is, how is it possible that no one noticed anything? Well, some had suspicions, and others had even tried to report Gacy, but without success. There are 2 people in particular who narrowly escaped death and survived, but the authorities did not believe their testimonies. Robert Donnelly, a 19-year-old student, was kidnapped by Gacy, tortured, raped, and then abandoned on the street. When he sought help and told his terrible experience to the police, no one believed him. The same fate befell Jeffrey Rignall, kidnapped and brutally attacked by Gacy. Despite his injuries and burns, the authorities ignored his testimony, demonstrating widespread prejudice against violent crimes, against homosexuals, and lack of interest in Gacy's victims. The discovery of Gacy was a terrible nightmare for investigators. It took a lot of hard work to recover all the bones of his victims buried under his house. The skeletons were piled on top of each other, making it difficult to distinguish between the bones and identify the victims. Some bodies had even been dismembered. When Gacy was finally arrested and prosecuted, he tried to claim that he suffered from dissociative identity disorder, stating that 4 different personalities lived inside him. There was the respectable contractor, Pogo the clown, the politician, and his dark side, Bad Jack the policeman. However, this tactic did not work, and he was found to be sane and sentenced to death. During the trial, Gacy tried to prove his innocence, but the jury had no doubts about his guilt. He was convicted of all 33 murders and sentenced to death. His execution was scheduled for May 10, 1994. Over the years in prison, Gacy devoted himself to painting and created works of art, often depicting clowns. Surprisingly, these paintings were sold at auction for considerable prices ranging from $200 to $20,000. In prison, Gacy also created a paid telephone line where he answered frequently asked questions about his case, gaining even more notoriety. His execution, despite all his desperate attempts to avoid it, eventually took place. During the lethal injection, there was a disturbing incident when the liquid temporarily solidified. However, in the end, John Wayne Gacy died shortly after midnight on May 10, 1994, declaring his innocence with his last words, Kiss my ass. The story of John Wayne Gacy is one of the darkest and most frightening in American criminal history, an example of how much can be hidden behind the facade of an ordinary life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and comment down below your opinion, and see you for the next crazy story.